Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to our seminar series. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Melati Nungsari. We have invited Dr. Melati today to share her research on the labor market indications of Rohingya construction workers in Peninsular Malaysia. Melati graduated from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And she was to me my classmate. And she now is the assistant professor at Asia School of Business in collaboration of MIT Sloan. Her research interests are market design, search and matching, and also labor economics and public economics. I know that today we are going to have a great knowledge from her, all right? So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Melati.
So thank you all for being here. I really look forward to spending a week here with you guys. Mike? You want me to wear a mic?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, okay, cool. So I'll be here for the upcoming week, so I'm very excited to learn and be here really. So thank you for that. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about this preliminary work really that I've been doing, and I'll tell you a little bit about why it's preliminary and where kind of my ultimate goal is. But we just wrapped up data collection for this project a couple weeks ago. Even some of the tables we won't even have incorporated our latest wave of data. So I won't give you a model or anything like that, but I will give you a lot of background, and in terms of what's going to happen is I'm going to tell you kind of what the ultimate goal of the project is. So I think Wasson already introduced me, but I work in Malaysia at a school basically set up between the Malaysian Central Bank and MIT Sloan. So this project is basically going to be focused on Malaysia, and in particular refugees in Malaysia. Alright, so the first question is, the people in the audience, you may want to ask, like, what is this about? Because I'm going to go through a lot of background, so I don't want you to lose sight of basically what the main question is. But the idea is, I'm trying to study how do refugees integrate in the labor market in their host countries. So specifically here, economists have tried to study this a little bit with immigrants. So you can imagine like Mexican immigrants moving to the US, the effect on the labor market, the effect on their mobility, on wages, stuff like that. But people really haven't looked at very much on how refugees integrate. And I'm going to try and convince you that is actually a very different question than sort of immigrants and sort of the literature around immigrants. And also, in particular here, I'm going to have a very unique opportunity, I think, to run field experiments, so a randomized control trial, to basically study how does the legalization of refugees into the labor market affect their long-term economic outcomes and also sort of social outcomes in their host country. So to do this, I have to tell you a lot of background, so just bear with me. And you can also interrupt me with any questions if you have any questions. All right, let's see. Motivation. So to do this, I'm going to tell you basically why this is important. So what I study in this project is basically this idea of forced migration or displacement, which is something that I think is one of the understudied but very important issues in the world. In particular, you may ask, how big is this problem? So according to the latest available data from the UN High Commissioner of Refugees, without which I wouldn't be able to do this study, there are about 68.5 million forcibly displaced people. And I'll tell you a little bit about the differences between, we call somebody a refugee versus an internally displaced person. But the idea is that there are tons of people. We, as academics, I think economists don't really understand how they integrate in their host countries very well. And so I think this is a very important issue. Now, just to kind of put this into perspective, basically there are as many forcibly displaced people in 2017 as the entire population of this country. So it's kind of a lot of people, right? And in terms of a little bit of statistics on this, so development economists, I think, will care more about this as time progresses because 85% of displaced people are hosted in developing countries. Around 57% come from these three countries, so South Sudan, in Africa, Afghanistan, and Syria. And of course, the top refugee hosting countries are going to be the countries that are around these countries, right? So Turkey, border Syria, Uganda, Pakistan, Lebanon, and Iran. So these are some sort of, overall sort of broad trends, and I'll tell you a little bit about how this pertains to Malaysia in just a second. But when I talk about refugees, this is basically what I mean. So the UN spends quite a significant amount of time, and I work closely with them on this, but basically determining whether or not you qualify for refugee status. So to be a refugee, you have to have fled your country because of persecution, war, or violence. So basically, if you were discriminated or targeted in sort of a violent sense because of your race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and you can kind of prove that, the UN grants you what we call refugee status, and then you're considered a refugee. Now, a lot of times this is different than, and you may hear this terminology, but these are the people we're not going to talk about in this study, but basically an internally displaced person. So an internally displaced person is somebody who may have to leave their home or village, but they never actually left their country. So you can think about this as maybe somebody in Syria had to leave their village or town in Syria, but never left Syria itself. Those people will be what we call internally displaced. We're not going to cover these people in the study, we're only going to be focusing on refugees. But I think it's important for sort of standardization of terminology here. We also have stateless people, also not covered by this, but a kind of distinction between this is that a stateless person versus a refugee is actually somebody who is not a citizen of any country. So if you have, so just going back to the definition of a refugee, so you could be a Syrian refugee, which means you hold a Syrian passport, but in that case, because you hold a Syrian passport, you are not stateless. So somebody who's stateless does not have a passport, you can think about it that way. And then asylum seekers. So sometimes I'll talk about asylum seekers, but the idea with asylum seekers is it's kind of the condition before you become a refugee. So what do I mean by this? Basically the idea is that you have a birth or home country, something happens, you flee. Typically you have to apply for asylum first, so the UN will grant you an asylum seeker status. You go to an intermediate host country, which Malaysia is one of the intermediate host countries in Southeast Asia, and then the idea is that UNHCR will then resettle you perhaps to a final host country. So final host countries sometimes it's Malaysia, oftentimes it is Malaysia because a lot of countries are not resettling people anymore, but in the past, a lot of host countries have been countries like US, Australia, Sweden, countries in Europe, stuff like that. So the idea is basically you go through this process and then your kind of goal as a refugee is to kind of get to this point. Now, in terms of what we know in the literature, I think there are a couple of things that we know quite well. So we know quite a lot about basically why people fled their country. So there's a lot of sort of political economy on why people left. So for example, there was this paper in 1992. This is before the Myanmar crises I think happened. But the idea here is that they used refugee immigration data to kind of track why did people leave and characterize them that way. There's a lot of studies about human rights abuses. So what happens right before they fled, what kind of caused people to flee. There's a lot of stuff on, of course, all the civil wars that happened. And these are just kind of selective. For each of these categories, there are tons of papers that you can find. There's a lot of political economy stuff going on. And of course, there is a lot of studies basically focusing on the Middle East. So refugees moving out of the Middle East, and then how do they integrate in other countries. We also know a lot about the extent of nature of trauma. We also know interventions that worked, particularly in psychology. Again, economists have not done anything in this field with regard to interventions, which is kind of interesting. But here, we know psychosocial interventions, we know what works psychiatrically. We have studied impact of detention on asylum seekers in Australia. People have studied psychiatric trauma of refugees in Europe. And of course, there's best practices, health interventions that work, counseling and stuff like that. And those are all pretty, I think, convincing studies that were, again, experimental, but are still not what we would consider like typical economics, right? So in terms of all of this, then the question is that, what do we know about sort of how refugees integrate into labor markets of their host country? And I think it's actually a very understudied problem. So these are kind of some of the big papers in the field. There was one in the 90s that looked at how Vietnamese refugees integrated into the Norwegian labor market. This talks about mobility, wages, unemployment, stuff like that, profession choice. There is some basically on high-skilled refugees. So this is the idea that maybe in Syria you were very high-skilled, you made a lot of money, you were kind of at the top of your profession. What happens to those high-educated people when they become a refugee and go to another country? So it turns out they found that unemployment was actually typically higher compared to a similar person who is Canadian. So not so good stuff. There was a paper in the Journal of Labor Economics that kind of did this quasi-experimental thing on ethnic enclaves. So partitions of the economy that are kind of separated by ethnicity, and looked at basically labor market outcomes. But again, this was for immigrants, not for refugees, so not for people who kind of have forced to go. There was another study in 2013 with cultural distance. So if you're very different than the local host country, how do you integrate? Are your wages higher? Is your ability to get a job better? That has also been studied, but again, in the context of Europe. And then finally, of course, and I just added this as everything else. So immigrants, and immigration, I think, is kind of well studied here. So Borjas, Kerr, Abramitsky, and Carroll all have kind of studied, the effects of immigration on local labor markets. So I'm trying to basically kind of fit what I'm doing here, but the nice thing is that I'm going to have the opportunity to randomize, which will be nice, and I'll tell you why. All right, questions on this? Okay. Cool. So, background on the Rohingya. So, we'll be focusing on this basically subgroup of refugees in Malaysia, and the reason is that because they're the most prominent one in Malaysia because of kind of numbers basically. But the idea is that just so you know, we're talking about the Rohingya people. They're an ethnic group who are mostly Muslim. They live basically in Myanmar, and all of them live in the coastal state of Rakhine. So if you look at Rakhine state, and this is kind of a zoomed in part, later on I'm going to try and control for sort of fixed effects with regards to locations, but they can be from one of 5 districts in Rakhine state. Most Rohingya are from Rakhine state, but some of them aren't, as we're going to see later, but that's the general idea here. Just a background on the conflict, why did they flee? So the idea, I think, and this is, again, just looking at some of the history stuff that's been done. So Myanmar was occupied by the British for quite a long time. And in this time, just like how they did in Malaysia, the British brought laborers from India and Bangladesh into Burma. So after independence, the Burmese government kind of viewed these migrations as illegal because many Burmese people, I think there was a religious clash here because of the Buddhist versus Islam thing, and so considered them to be Bengali and not Burmese. There was a military coup where all citizens had to obtain national registration cards. Rohingya were only given foreign identity cards. So in this sense, they actually became stateless because their government did not actually issue them any sort of documentation that proved that they were part of the country. So they were not recognized as one of Myanmar's 135 groups, and since then, since 1982, there have been sort of these periodic violent crackdowns where you basically see hundreds of thousands of people fleeing to neighboring countries. So if you look at the numbers here, which are from UNHCR data, a lot of them actually end up in Malaysia. There are refugee camps in Bangladesh where I think a majority of them end up, but a significant amount of them actually do end up in Malaysia. So if you look, sometimes they go very far to Saudi. They tend to go to countries that have majority Muslims because they are also Muslim, which is why I think they end up in Malaysia. But the idea is they're kind of everywhere. And again, this is, I would say, one of the most understudied refugee populations in the world, so we're going to try and focus on them. All right, so in terms of Malaysia, so there are more than 160 registered refugees. Now this means that there's actually significantly more than 160. These are the ones who are registered, and I'll tell you what that means in just a second. So unlike many host countries, and I was trying to look up this for Thailand, I think, and I think Thailand has some refugee camps, I believe, on the border, right? So in Malaysia, actually, it's very interesting because they don't live in camps. So in terms of the logistics, is a bit different than what happens there. A lot of them, out of this 160, are from Myanmar. We have the Rohingyas, the Chins, the other Myanmar Muslims, the Rakhines, the Arakanese, and all other different ethnicities. And we also have tons of other refugees and asylum seekers from other countries. So Malaysia hosts Pakistanis, Yemenis, Somalis, Syrians, Sri Lankans, Afghans, Iraqis, Palestinians, etc., etc. I think we host more than 80 refugees from more than 80 countries, which is a lot for a small country of, 35 million. So we have sort of this diversity in terms of refugees, and the thing is, because they don't live in camps, they're actually able to move around. So the logistics, I think, are a bit different than, say, studying how integration and how labor market conditions work when the refugees are sort of clumped together in camps. So there's that. In terms of the background, so the idea here is that once you get registered by UNHCR, you receive what is called a card. This card does not grant any legal status. What it does is it just says that UNHCR knows that you exist. And so here you'll have your name. It's just like an identity card. So your name, your birth date, etc., etc. But the idea here is that Malaysia is actually not party to the 1951 Refugee Convention, which means that the refugees can't actually legally work. They have no access to public services. They can't use public hospitals. They can't vote. Their kids can't go to school. So in a sense, it's actually a significantly worse outcome for them because, again, they're kind of excluded from public resources. Now, the point here, though, is that even though they're not legally allowed to work, there have been attempts in the past to kind of give them legal access to work. And what do I mean by that? So, and this is where the randomization comes in. So in March of 2016, the government actually ran this pilot project. So the project allowed 300 registered Rohingya refugees. Again, we're focusing on the Rohingya because they're the majority, basically, of all refugees in Malaysia. But the idea is, the Malaysian government was trying to test out whether this legalization thing would work. So they basically granted these 300 legal passes. So effectively, if you held one, you could legally work. So this went on, but the problem was that they could only work in plantations. So for those of you who haven't been to Malaysia there are a lot of plantations in Malaysia, which is kind of a remnant of colonial times, I would say. But there's a lot of palm oil plantations, a lot of rubber plantations. So the idea was that they were going to let people basically work on these plantations, and it turned out that didn't work that well. So the Rohingya didn't really want to do plantation work. It was not a good fit for them. They had to leave their families to go and live in these kind of rural places, which they did not like. They typically like to live in the city, and again, they're free to move wherever they want in the country. So all parties concluded basically that plantation was not a good fit for them. So then I came into this picture basically around like right here, like in between phase 2. But the idea of phase 2 is they tried to do it. They were like, okay, plantations don't work. Let's try to legalize them in the manufacturing sector, which is actually a bread factory. So the bread factory worked a little bit better, but the problem, of course, was that, as I'm going to show you in a bit, they are quite illiterate. So when you're working in a factory and you see like a sign that says like danger, they can't read that. So they didn't like it. I think historically people there was this sense in the community that they didn't like it, so it worked slightly better than the plantations, but not quite. And so, the question was, so the government basically asked UNHCR, so if plantations don't work, if factory and manufacturing don't work, then where should we legalize them first? So the idea here is they didn't want to automatically legalize everybody. They just were trying to sort of pick sectors and then legalize them in those sectors and then slowly then incorporate them into the broader economy. So we looked at the data. It seemed that most of what they did was actually construction. So 47% of employment was construction. They also did cleaning, various cleaning in different, working for companies or working for sort of independent cleaners. Agriculture, so some of them, were landscapers and people who kind of did your lawn. Manufacturing was about, I think, slightly less than 5%. So here, basically, it became clear that when we investigated the 16% a bit more, because we could argue that maybe that's plantation, it showed that they're actually not really involved in plantation work. It was mainly, again, this landscaping and sort of small-scale grass cutting and stuff like that. So what happened was that was when UNHCR reached out to me and said, okay, so can you do basically a detailed study of the labor market for Rohingya refugees, but only focusing on construction? Because, again, construction seemed to be kind of where most of them were. I should point out here that the women, it's a very traditional society where the women don't work. So we focus on the men because the men are actually the one participating in the Malaysian economy. All right. And again, this is quite, so August 12th was the report, and then they still have to okay it, which is why I kind of had to suppress some details here, and I didn't quite get to the modeling, but it's all quite recent. We spent the summer collecting the data, and then we'll move on from there. All right, questions about that? Good?
So where are the locations of the plants that you say that the Rohingya is not want to work at the bread factory, something like that? Where is the location?
So this one or
No,
the bread factory?
Yes.
The bread factories were all in KL.
In KL.
They were in KL. So they actually gave in phase 2 another 300 legal permits. Only 16 people signed up.
Okay.
And out of the 16, it's dropped to 8. So only 8 people are still working on the bread factories. And we interviewed the 8 that dropped out, and they said that they were just worried. There were not good instructions given to them in the factory, so they just felt like they were in danger a lot because they couldn't read, and it was just scary to them.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing to notice also about them is that they're not, when they left Myanmar, it was still kind of not quite industrialized, so working with big machines and factories like that I think scared them, so that didn't work. Which is strange because construction works. Yeah.
How about the phase 1?
The what?
How about the phase 1?
The first one, the plantations?
The plantation, how well?
Yeah, so I hope I have a map here. So, maybe. No. Oh, so I wanted to show you basically, the plantations were not in KL. The closest one I think was 2.5 hours away by car.
But how well that they received by the Rohingya government?
The plantation people? So with the plantations, I think the government paired up with plantation companies who basically were guaranteed labor, like X amount of labor. And that didn't work well, again, I think because of the geographical part. So it was supposed to be only open to young men, but I think they opened it to all men, and the men were like, can we bring our kids and women? And then they said no, so that didn't work. So both of these failed. So I think the first one they had, the plantation one, I think they had like 35 people sign up, so also not very good. So they've kind of started to look at construction, basically. So the interesting part is what I found is that a lot of the typical way people get jobs, when you think about labor, right, is basically you get it through networks. A lot of people get it through networks. And so the idea is like, I think there was a first push of people who came from Myanmar and got jobs in construction. And then from then on, it was like, come to Malaysia, there can work in construction jobs here. So everybody just keeps on getting funneled into construction. In fact, from the almost 400 people we surveyed, I think all of them got jobs from social networks.
So I have a question. So
Yes.
what kind of work they do in the construction?
Yeah, I'll talk about that in a little bit, but it's actually very interesting because it's very, there's a career progression. There's a clear kind of, you choose a trade, like glass making or bricklaying, and then you move up the trade. So first you carry bricks to people and you pick up the trash, and then slowly you kind of, I'll show you, but there's kind of a progression there. Any other questions? Okay, so construction overall in Malaysia, so contributed to about 7% of the Malaysian GDP. We think about them in sort of 4 sectors. So there's residential buildings, there's non-residential buildings, there's civil engineering, and there's sort of what we call special trade projects. So these are kind of like parts of entire construction projects, and the sectors that the Rohingya focus on in Malaysia would actually be residential. So they like big neighborhoods though, not small neighborhoods. So the development is trying to build, I don't know, like 2,000 houses in sort of a lot. They typically would be employing the Rohingya there. The regulatory board for the construction industry is known as the Construction Industry Development Board. I tried to speak with them a little bit about this, but the idea is that CIDB regulates workplace safety. They issue these cards, but again, refugees can't legally work. So what happens in sort of this paper is that all of them tend to kind of try and find ways to get around CIDB. CIDB is, I think, more feared. The refugees fear CIDB more than the police, I would say. because again of this fact that they sort of regulate the entire construction industry. All right, wages. So sorry, this is kind of slow, but this is an overview of construction wages, just so you know roughly what they make. These are in ringgit, so for dollars you would divide this by 4. So a lot of these are actually RM per day, so this is what they'd be making per day. And if you notice, actually the rates are quite good. So if you look at wiring, so a lot of people, they aspire to be wiremen. The wiremen make around 317.4.45. This is actually monthly, so this is about like slightly like $900 US dollars per month. Just to give you an idea, this would actually be a starting salary for a fresh graduate in Malaysia would be around this. So you make pretty good money once you get to a certain point. In terms of bricklaying, so this is again per day. So in 2016 they made about 100 ringgit per day. This kind of agrees with the data later on. But as you can see, the general wages in construction are actually pretty high compared to what they did in Myanmar and stuff like that. So I just kind of wanted to show this. So the idea here is that there's sort of an experiment that we have proposed that I think we'll be able to do, where we're still trying to negotiate some details. But the idea, sorry, yes?
Just a quick one. What is the minimum wage here?
Minimum wage is 1,005.
Per day?
Per
day gonna be about what? Per day?
Per day, so if you work 20 days, so 150 divided by 20.
50 ringgit per day?
No, that would be higher, I think, right? What is that? So 150 divided by 20.
75 ringgit per day?
Yeah. Ringgit. So that is $20, 20 something dollars. What is it in Thailand?
Okay. 30 something ringgit per day.
Multiply by 10.
30 ringgit per day.
30 ringgit per day? Okay. Yeah, so they make, so the first thing that I was surprised is that they make good money. They make very good money. And in particular, if you look, like, again, if you do very skilled things like wiring, you actually make quite a lot, right? And that kind of goes up to, I've heard people who make, when we were doing the salary, the max per day was 130 ringgit, which, again, they make quite a lot. So that's kind of one of the features here as well. But again, so I'm going to show you, we collected some data and ran this survey, but kind of the main goal that I wanted to think about is sort of this proposed experimental design, this RCT that we're going to run. So they've told us that they want to start next year on phase 4 of the work pilot, or they're going to start from scratch, but this time they're going to do it basically for the construction industry, which we think will be a good fit. So the idea is, again, if you oversubscribe the program, you can run a lottery, and then you can basically randomly select who gets the treatment, which here is actually the legal work rights, and then you can measure basically what that did to them and kind of how that compares to the control group throughout time. Now, the idea is, again, just very quickly, but this is the goal of the study is to do this. The rest of it is kind of background work. But the idea is, you announce it for the work rights, presumably because it's focused on construction, they will sign up. Because, again, that's what they're already doing. Do a baseline survey, lottery, program starts, and then we kind of follow them throughout time and compare them to the treatment group and see basically whether or not, or how much more does legalization actually help them. One problem here, which we're a bit worried about, was when they were in the plantation jobs in the bread factory, they were only promised minimum wage. Now, the problem for construction industry is you cannot promise them legal rights and say we're only going to pay you minimum wage because, again, the market rates are much higher, right? So you can't, that's kind of a problem we're trying to work out, but the idea here is that they're already making pretty good money, you have to kind of promise them more. All right, so now I'm going to basically tell you kind of where we are in terms of the data part. Again, we just finished collecting this. But the idea is that we had to do a lot of background research. So when I first started doing this, most of my training is actually in IO. I don't do that much labor. This is actually kind of I do pensions, which I guess is kind of labor. But I was trying to figure out, like, what do people know about these people? And at ASB, we only have 3 economists. So I didn't have very many colleagues to talk to, so I'm kind of excited to hear what you guys have to say about this and kind of what I can do with this. But the idea is that I had to do a lot of background research. And so we had to collect data from them because we didn't know basically how their lives were and stuff like that. But it was quite challenging, to be very frank. So they're mainly illiterate. They cannot read, which is a big problem. They are not used to sitting down and sort of answering questions in a structured way, so that was also difficult. They don't speak the local language or really English. And if they do, they don't speak very well, so we needed to find interpreters, which is also difficult because a lot of them, again, they don't speak English or Malay, so we had to find interpreters who can speak English and Malay, so that was very difficult. We didn't know where to find them really because they don't live in camps, so it's kind of hard to find. And then once found, like how do you know you're actually sampling correctly, right? I mean, sure, that you can tell everybody lives in this area, but you don't know the sampling is done accurately. There were a lot of cultural differences in interpreting questions. We had to pilot the survey many, many times to make sure that people were kind of getting it. And then, of course, our partner in this was basically the UN. So the way we basically got people was what we call consecutive sampling, basically through the UN. So let me tell you a little bit about that. So this summer, we collected data from refugee construction workers. 397 of them. Data was mainly collected at the UNHCR office, basically at the point of registration. So the idea is, again, remember those cards that I showed you? So they have to come in to get a card. And so the idea is that the card expires. So every 2 years, they have to come in and renew their cards. So we basically try to kind of get them there, where if you self-identified as Rohingya, you worked in construction in the past year, everybody who satisfied those criteria basically came in and were surveyed by the team. So this was the best I think we could do in terms of trying to get them, because again they don't live in camps. But we basically got everybody who satisfied the criteria to come in. So 100% for each day that we were there, which is 2 to 5 days a week. And actually it was averaging about like 4 days a week. Some days because of prayer days and public holidays we weren't there, but for most days in those 3 months we were there. So this was kind of the main point. So this is KL. We also found out that once we talked to people, it seemed that a lot of other refugees were kind of concentrated on the northern states. So we did get people we took a trip, basically like a 2-week-long trip, where we basically did very intensive interviews with people here. But the people here are, of course, there's a lot of selection bias here, right? Because they're not coming in sort of randomly to come in and get their cards. So these people were discarded from the sample. I think we ended up with like 300 something. But in the numbers I'm going to show you later, I think I didn't include the last wave of data because again, I didn't really have time to do that. But the idea is once we do, we'll be focusing on the people here because these people were kind of sampled better, I think, than the people who came here. So for all of the other places, the green places, we told the community leaders to call their friends, basically working in construction. So the selection there was terrible, so those were kind of dropped out from the survey, dropped out from the analysis. Okay, so the survey had 49 questions, some of which had multiple parts. It also included 9 open-ended questions. They were paid a very small cash amount at the end of the survey for their time. The surveys were conducted in Rohingya or Bahasa, if they understood Bahasa, which most of the time wasn't true. So we had to use interpreters. Our schedule had to also be dependent on whether or not the interpreters would come. Typically, though, we were able to do this pretty fast. So it took typically 30 minutes, although it ranged from 18 minutes. So these were the people who spoke quite good Bahasa to 1 hour and 20 minutes. So we got pretty quick at doing these pretty easily. We had to use sort of a visual type of Likert scale. Because again, like how do you ask people, I mean, they were not, they can't read. So we had to, ask them a question, phrase it correctly so that they could just point to basically how they felt. And
so you have to ask them in Rohingya, right? In their language.
Yep. Yeah, and then we had to explain so it was hard because some of them, like the distinction between like this and this was like they were like, does this mean funny? So there was a lot of cultural things where it needed to like be ironed out, but it got done. It got done. All right, so we used this for some of the Likert questions because we couldn't do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but this worked pretty well actually for us. All right, questions before I show you some of this stuff? No questions. You guys are good. All right, so what did we know about them? So we have, again, these numbers are 2-something, I think. Some of these didn't have spouses, so were dropped. Some of them, because of incomplete information, were dropped, but I didn't add sort of the last wave of data here. This is the data from the report. But basically, we have age, time in Malaysia, we have brothers, sisters, mothers, we have spouse. Some of them had more than one spouse, so that was also reported. How many kids they had, how many other family in Malaysia, how many people lived in their house, how many bedrooms they had, how much they paid in rent. We also had some police questions. So how many times did you get caught by the police? Question, so not jail. We also had jail. We also had how many times you paid your bribe, typical amount of bribes. We have number of bosses in construction. Some of them also did other jobs, so we took data on that too. So the people who worked in restaurants as well as construction, landscaping, cleaning, interpreting, not very many, and any other occupations that are not sort of the big ones. We also have language, so how well do you speak the language? We did Rohingya, Malay, Rakhine, Burmese, English, Arabic, Bengali, Hindi, and I think there were also, I thought we did Urdu as well, maybe we didn't do that. We did daily wage to kind of figure out, so the interesting thing to note here is that they were quoted daily wages. So if you were a construction worker and you go to the construction site, your boss will tell you, I will pay you 50 ringgit per day. So you're quoted daily wages, but you're not paid daily, you're often actually paid monthly. So we did daily wages, and then we asked also monthly, how much did you bring back? Average daily working hours. We asked how many days you worked overtime in a month, how many days you worked in a month, monthly income in Myanmar, so how much did you make before you came to Malaysia, food costs, travel costs, electricity costs, water costs, and savings. And then we had a series of these Likert questions, basically, which were, how, like, I feel home in Malaysia, or I'm happy, or I'm optimistic about my life in Malaysia, and stuff like that. And I'll show you what the responses there were as well. So just some highlights from the data. Again, so you can kind of see here that they are, for the most part, very illiterate, very uneducated, I would say. So most of them have not gone to any sort of formal schooling. Most of them have not done much past elementary school. So very sort of poorly educated, quite young. So average, I think, was around 25. We saw very few below 18, which is kind of the legal age to work. 25 was kind of where I think the average was, and then we saw very few old people, which makes sense because these tend to be quite physical jobs. They have also generally not been in Malaysia very long. There was a very big wave of people coming from Myanmar in 2014, which is reflected here. So people have been kind of around, I think it was like 4.2 was the average, so haven't been in Malaysia very long. Daily wages were about, I think the average was around 55. So, but as again, like you can see here, there were people who were making well below 90, and there were also people who were making like 15 a day. And then monthly income. So the interesting thing that we saw here was that if you looked at sort of monthly income, it didn't actually agree. If you tallied up, if you looked at these people and see how many days you worked, we saw that basically daily wages are only correlated with monthly income, but actually don't agree completely. So it seemed like even though they were quoted, 50 ringgit a day, and they work 25 days, you would expect them to get 50 times 25, but they would get significantly less actually. So we think that's because, again, counting. So they can tell you that, somebody told them they will be paid 50 ringgit a day, but because they have to take care of their own, like they have to keep track of how many days they work, then they have to multiply everything, and so I don't know that the multiplication works so well, and I don't know that the employer keeps track, so that was kind of something there. So we think that the daily wage is sort of a better proxy of how much they make, just because, well actually the monthly, sorry, because that's actually what they take home versus what they were quoted when somebody told them that they have that work. Most of them, again, were paid monthly. They rarely talk to any other refugees. So we asked them, have you talked to any Syrians or any other of the many refugee groups in Malaysia? Most of them actually have not. But they pretty much talk to, a lot of them, like almost half of them actually do talk to Malaysians quite a lot. treatment. We asked them, do you think your employer treats Bangladeshi workers or Indonesian workers better than you? A lot of them said they didn't know, so that was that. We asked them, again, these are some of the liker questions. So this was, my employer is nice to me, I am paid on time, if I work hard I get a higher wage, I feel at home, my family feels at home, and I'm optimistic about my life in Malaysia. And these are basically what the proportions were. The interesting thing is, they generally actually feel quite at home relative to, I think, what you would expect. But so the interesting thing about this is when the UN talked to us, they were like, well, it would be helpful for us to advocate for them if they were very unhappy. But it turns out actually they're quite happy, and they're making quite a lot of like a good amount of money. Not to say that there's always other problems with workplace stuff, but in general, it's pretty. The picture is quite nice, not bad. I feel safe. I have access to good health care. I have enough food. I am rarely stressed. Malaysians trust me to do a good job. I have enough money every day for me and my family. And then one day I want to go back to Myanmar. So those are kind of the liker questions there. And the interesting thing to note is that a significant portion of them actually do want to go back to Myanmar, although I don't think that will happen, but a lot of them kind of have expressed that they do want to go back. Let's see, area of origin. So this is where they were kind of distributed in Malaysia. These are possessions. So we asked them, do you have electricity? Do you have water? Do you have a cell phone? Do you have a stove? Do you have internet? Where internet can be, I think we did like phone, dial-up, any sort of access to internet. They didn't have to be like wireless. It could be anything else. So they had sort of access to basic utilities, but like the more luxury things like a car and microwave, very few did. And these are kind of where they said they were from. So most of them, again, are from Rakhine, but we have sort of a little bit from different states as well. And as you can see here, and I should have done the picture, but a lot of them actually live sort of in the north, so Penang, 23%, and then very few actually live in KL, which is why, again, the phase 2 didn't really work because of the fact that, KL, there are not actually that many refugees in KL. Remittances, this is actually what I was interested in terms of building a model, but this is just exploratory. So on average, they sent about 30% of their monthly salaries home. Sometimes some of them did have family in Thailand, but typically is either Myanmar or Bangladesh. The median bribe was about 200 ringgit per bribe. Median total payout was about 450. So this idea was that, again, they don't have legal protection, so if they get into trouble with the police, they have to pay the police. So we asked them, how much do you pay out? So that's kind of what we got. And then we also compared, so there is this literature, I think the paper I showed you, the JLE paper, one of the papers, was talking about mobility, right? So what happens to people who are making a lot of money once they become refugees and kind of go to another country? So compared to what they were making in Malaysia, they actually made an average about $45 per month when they were in Myanmar. Some of them made nothing, right? So because they were subsistence farmers. So it seems like, and we have some data to support this, but it seems like they actually kind of increased. There was upward mobility for them versus a lot of Middle Eastern migration, which was downward mobility because unemployment went up and salaries, relative salaries and absolute salaries went down. But it seems like with the Rohingya actually do kind of better. So that was interesting to know as well.
So I have a question.
Yep.
So did you ask them about the channel they send the money back to?
Yep. Yeah. So we have data on that. They all use Western Union. Yeah, which I think takes quite a lot out. I'm not sure how Western Union works. Do you know?
Right. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I wonder how they're gonna provide the information when they just contact with the staff at the Western Unions, right?
Yep.
Because you say that they don't know anything, they cannot read.
So what we have found, so we actually probed a little bit on that. So they will just bring cash, I guess, to the Western Union, and then the Western Union will send it to somebody in Yangon, who is then supposed to bring the money to Rakhine State to give to the family members. I don't know how much gets there. That'd actually be an interesting thing, right? The financial part of like how, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so in terms of career progression, so this is something interesting that we found out as well. So we asked them a lot of questions about like how do the jobs work in general, and so the idea is that, like, so I'm an IO person, so there's like horizontal differentiation, which is basically like what trade you're in. So you can be like a glass person, you can be a plumbing person or a wiring person, you can be a mosaic person, you can be a carpenter person, but the idea is that you choose your trade, and then within the trade, there's sort of this hierarchy. So the idea is that you have workers, and then, well actually let's start from the top. So you have a big construction company. In Malaysia we have like 8 really, really big ones, who then hire out a contractor. So the contractor typically is Malaysian, but the contractor will find a subcontractor who is generally actually Rohingya. And so the idea is that the subcontractor will then hire all these different workers, right? So say the subcontractor may need 2 carpenters, 3 glass people, and 4 plumbers. So then he'll hire basically these people out. Now the idea is that you start from the bottom and you basically work your way up. So the idea is that, you know, you start in plumbing, first you kind of carry things around, and then you work for a subcontractor. Maybe as time progresses, you become yourself a subcontractor, which is kind of the goal. And then you can never go above a subcontractor because those are typically sort of front-facing things. So Malaysians are the ones who take care of that, but subcontractors make pretty good money. So the idea is kind of to progress up and then you become a subcontractor. Now because of this also, the people who are subcontractors tend to have a lot of pull. So because of this, the sort of network effects of all of this kind of feed in towards this as well. So if I have somebody who just arrived in Malaysia from Myanmar, I would basically try and get them to join construction because I already know that everybody else works in construction, right? So they're kind of strong network effects with regards to how you get these jobs. So there's kind of the vertical progression as well. All right, so this is kind of the overall thing, and I can send you the report once it's approved, but the idea is this: we have data on this. Now, what can I do with this? Again, my main goal is sort of this experimental design, but I also ran some, basic regressions to see whether or not there are correlations. Again, nothing is identified. I haven't figured out how to do that yet. So if you have any suggestions, I would be very, very willing to hear them. So these are just basically my data tables. So here I was thinking about effects on remittances, which again, if you look at sort of the correlations, again, there's no model here, just me throwing things in, but it did seem like there was a strong family aspect to this. So if you had a child in Malaysia, you would send significantly less. The higher your income, you would expect the higher your remittances are. If you have a mother, you typically send more. If you have a father, you typically would actually send less, I believe. Well, no, if you have a father in Malaysia, this is before we controlled it. Yeah, well, you should send more. But again, not significant, right? These are just me throwing things together. So one thing that is interesting, I think, could be like what affects remittances. I controlled later on for locational fixed effects, which didn't really change the p-values very much, but did show that people from different states actually sent more or less. Again, not very significant, so there is that as well. But remittances, I thought, could be an interesting thing to study. Wages, this is just me throwing things in. So wages kind of behave the way you would expect them to, so nothing terribly interesting except for having fathers. So fathers seem to kind of be, whether or not your father was around, because I think the idea was that fathers take care of unmarried sisters and mothers, right? So if your father is in Malaysia, that means he's not home, you will have to actually send more back and therefore have to make more money. I think that was kind of one of the hypotheses. But again, just very kind of correlational. Times jail, because we have that as well. So how many times were you thrown into jail? Didn't really find anything that interesting except for having a children in Bangladesh. I don't know what, again, I can't really explain that. But I thought that would be an interesting sort of dependent variable to look at. And then I also did some locational fixed effects as well. But that were kind of like the 3 main things I thought were interesting. I'm curious if you guys have any other interesting things that you think I could get from this. Again, there's no model, it's just correlational for now. But I'd like to hear any thoughts on that, I guess. If you have, we can talk. So there's a lot of integration measures, but it seems like a lot of them are actually I haven't looked that much into the integration parts as well. So we can do that. We can do that too, but we haven't really thought about that very much. Mainly correlations for now. So I haven't been able to look at the data in full length, but that's kind of where we're at now. So maybe I can tell you a little bit about the conclusion, and then we can talk a bit more about the data. But the idea is like, this is the first study basically on sort of how Rohingya refugees integrate anywhere in the world. They're kind of extremely understudied. We found some interesting correlational results, like with regards to family, but we also have a wealth of qualitative data. So we collected vast amounts of like open-ended questions. We have tons of text with hours and hours and hours of this, which I think my co-author wants to do sort of a textual analysis. That's not really what I do, but apparently you can use machine learning and try and pull out some interesting themes, so we're looking at that as well. The interesting thing that I did want to look at is the sort of idea of upward mobility. I have to figure out how to do this though, because I have to figure out how to do this. But we kind of want to look at, what happens basically as they were forced out of Myanmar. And then for future work, of course, we need to figure out what we want to do. I mean, we kind of collected this data because it was opportunistic. We need to figure out this textual analysis part, which I feel like is something that economists are getting more and more into. I'm from a business school, and people in marketing love textual analysis, but we have never done it before, so we'll have to think about that a little bit. But the plan is, now I feel quite confident that we know the construction worker population very well, so we're able to pitch, I think, a program that will work. And if we do that correctly, we'll get oversubscription, which means we can randomize and do a sort of an experimental treatment that I think might be more interesting. Yeah, and I think that's it. I was given 1.5, but I thought we could spend some time to discuss it and stuff. So sorry there's no model. I know the economists always want to see models, but model's still in my head and to be worked out. So we can discuss. Yes.
So your plan on the RCT is
Yep.
looking at on the oversubscribe.
Yep.
And then luckily then in the sense that instead of self-select,
Yep.
but it's going to be like more literally
Yep.
to get into the job. But the problem is that is kind of, it seems that it's quite difficult to get oversubscribe, or
I'm confident we can. I'm confident
or
we will.
do you think that if you do that in like Penang
Yep.
and
Yep.
Yahoo, right?
Yep.
Yahoo,
Johor,
right?
yep.
Yeah, that might be the case where you can
Yep.
get the over.
So we told them that we want to do it in Penang, Johor, and I think there was another East Coast state that was high. So it can't be done in KL. So KL, I think there are just not terribly many people working construction in KL anyway. So we're trying to get them to go to Penang, Johor, and I think another state.
I don't know. I mean, I was thinking another way in the sense of like maybe I'm not quite sure yet.
Yeah.
But I'm like the idea, but
Yeah.
it might be something related to network. Like
Yep.
you
Tell me
could-
more.
It's like I think about like in the case that there is an experiment on the way that you give the invitation, like randomly provide the invitation to attend the job, kind of like job seeking or job matching kind of things. So I get, I'm not quite sure. So in this case, it's not like oversupply, subscribe, but in
So you
another
don't need
So-
you don't need oversubscription to do what you're saying. You can just do a treatment arm where you
so
get-
this one is like looking at the networking effect. I don't know if that can looking at the networking effects or
That's
not,
interesting.
but it's going to be on the other side if you give the invitation somehow, do something interaction with the networking
Yeah.
or somehow, and then you might get something more. I don't know. I mean, just
No, that's interesting.
yeah.
Yeah, we never thought about that. I've always been very confident that we will get oversubscription, so I'm like, we will get 305, and then we will be like, we'll just run a lottery, but you're right.
Yeah, I think I remember there is the experiment that do on the invitation and then see it's like the those who receive the invitation randomly will be most likely to get into or to go to the.
Do you remember the name of that paper? Who wrote it?
I remember.
Okay.
I'm not.
That's cool though.
Which one?
Some part of the experiment on the invitation letter to attend some job training or something. I think it's kind of like the invitation to attend the job training, but I cannot remember exactly the name of that experiment. You can try some search.
So first question for the qualifications.
Yep.
So you have 397 Rohingya refugees, right? And you get this from the collected at the UNHCR.
Yeah, so I should clarify that. So the 397 were everybody that was surveyed. That includes the green dots.
Okay.
So we discarded those because those were not what we considered representative. So yeah. So the 397 was everybody. So there were 88 who were the greens, which we discarded when we did them. And we only took, I think, 309 or something, yeah.
But this all in the constructions.
They are only construction.
Can you get others also?
Ooh, that's interesting. So just overall?
Yes.
Yeah, we could have done that. Yeah, we wanted to. We only had budget for 3 months, so we had to focus on construction. But yeah, we could have done it for overall. Yeah.
Yeah, because I thought that it might be like a more interesting, like in your analysis. But you want to look at the refugees, that how they can involve in the labor market in Malaysia, and if you can have like a different kind of maybe like a Rohingya that work in Malaysia, you may be able to like differentiate between like the career that they did. Right?
Yeah,
and in terms of remittances also, because right now you control for the household, right? The characteristic of the household. But if you can like have different kind of career path that they can go, you may have more interested into like investigate. Yeah. So you might have time to do that because you collect at the UNHCR already. I think many have to come to the UNHCR. You can collect the data on that.
No, that's a great point. Yeah, the opportunity to do this kind of came quickly, so we were like, oh, this is construction. But you're right. I mean, the thing is, I don't think it's. I really honestly don't think it's possible to study this population without UNHCR, because how would you find them? How would you sample them? So the best what we thought was this: they have to renew their cards. It's kind of random when they come in, so we'll just get everybody that way. But if we survey all Rohingya who basically come in instead of only construction, then
I think it's really more interesting, and I think you can find like a more interesting thing from your analysis, especially for like the model, because you throw many things in there, but one thing that like missing from your
is comparison.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll be here for a week so we can talk more.
Is there any questions?
Just I'm not sure why, because for integration, right? I just wonder what's going to be a good thing to be a measure of integration in this type of studies. So I'm not sure what is it normally going to be a norm of this type of study. We have remittance, right? We have wage, right? But how can we measure integration? Should we kind of put it as our dependent variable here, or should we use it as an independent variable here? I'm not sure. I don't know about the model yet. Okay, I can't think.
Well, there's no model yet, so.
Yeah, I cannot think about it real quick right now. Okay, how can we use integration as being explained by something, or use integration to explain some things? One part I may think about being happy, right? That you use, right? Being happy here maybe.
That's what we were thinking, like
which we can use for integration.
Or like there was a question where it's like I feel optimistic about my future in Malaysia, specifically in Malaysia. But
that might be. But I'm not sure whether you asked about whether you feel good or bad when they stay back home or not.
I did.
You did, right? So at least we can use some side of this thing to say that yes.
We did ask that.
When you move here, okay, on lighter scale, you'll be happier, and happier, and can use whether they are happier and explain something, or explain why they are happier. In that regard, I'm not sure whether we can do that with your questionnaire or not.
I didn't think about that, but yeah, we did ask. Yeah, we did ask that. So actually look into that.
So we
basically, I'm trying to measure the difference between
over there and here.
Right.
Or some simple thing like because we know that one of the problems for Rakhine State is that can you easily go to your Muslim temple, to your mosque or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Over there, you might not be able to go. If you go there, you're gonna get killed. But if you go to Malaysia, you might have a chance to go there, feeling more happy or whatever, right? Can you use this thing as an integration marble or not? I'm not sure. Okay, but just try. Just think of something at the top of my head about integration right now.
Yeah.
Because they might feel happier, they might feel more integrated if that religious activity is not limited to.
That's a good point. Yeah.
To like over there, and we actually can do that if I'm not sure whether we can use something like. It might be bad for me to do that here. But if you know where they come from, right? You know the state where they come from in Myanmar, right? Can we count number of mosques over there? And then in Malaysia, right? You know where they stay, right? We might think about something like now how many mosques you can go there, right? Because I think that might be one part of integration. The second part, okay. I just want to know about what is their jobs over there before they come to Malaysia.
I can tell you that, yeah.
If you have that information too, we can look at that. If they switch the job from whatever they do over there in subsistence level or whatever, I don't know what it is.
Yep.
But right now they move to, I would call it more skill job, right?
Yep.
So that might make more integration more interesting. That yes, this one is kind of like, as you say, it's moving upward.
Right.
But integration by getting a new job, getting new training skill, whatever here.
Yep.
If we have some type of that question, we can put that as an integration too. I really like to see your questionnaire. you have really part, okay, and you can think more about the variable here.
I can share that with you.
I want to see your questionnaire. What you ask them over there. That might be nice. Okay, so just saying that we can define some.
I should have. Yeah, that I can send that to you. No problem. Yeah, but that's a good point. So we did. So it turns out that a lot of them were subsistence farmers, or they actually were. They would sell things. So they were traders, but they didn't make very much. And when they came to Malaysia, so I'm pretty confident saying like most men from Myanmar who come to Malaysia will be funneled into construction. A lot of them would complain like it took me 2 years and I didn't know anything and I had never seen a big building before, but then they put me there and I learned. So yeah.
Truth be told, okay, it happened in Thailand too.
Yeah.
When we just imported a lot of Myanmar, not Rohingya, okay?
Yeah.
Import a lot of Myanmar, a lot of Cambodia, a lot of people.
Yeah.
They didn't construct any high building before.
Yeah.
But right now, yes. They all right. Even if you go to, sorry to just say this, if you just go to some department store in Thailand and order pad Thai, the one who cook your pad Thai gonna be Myanmar. I cook the pad Thai. So I call this integration, okay?
Yeah,
because
I agree.
You learn new skills and then you can, in this case, okay, if they can cook, if they can change their job to do something that Malaysian people like, okay.
Yeah, I agree.
In that case, we can yes use this as our dependent variable here, that you just integrate, right? In terms of religion, in terms of jobs, in terms of better life condition as you have already. So and that might be fun to do things here with all those unconventional economics variable.
Thank you. Yeah, so a lot of them would say, you know, like we also asked in the long form question, like why are you working construction rather than anything else? Like why do you prefer construction over working as a dishwasher in a restaurant? And a lot of them would say, because with construction I get skills, and with skills I can go anywhere. Like working in a restaurant is like, so I learned how to wash dishes. That's not really something I can bring to market. But I thought that was very interesting because they would say things like, I could work anywhere. I can work in Dubai. Like they'll never make it to Dubai, but like they feel like they have this marketable skill now and they can use it anywhere. So I thought that was interesting.
And for dishwashing, it kind of quite similar to after you wash the dish, right? You're gonna be kind of like helping cutting things in the kitchen, and then you can move up the step, right, to be a sous chef, whatever.
Well, so my understanding is, so I don't think there's as much mobility in the dishwashing. I think if you're a dishwasher, you're just
normally okay. It happened even in UK.
Okay.
When Thai students go there, right? At first you wash dish. later on you just what? You just roll a spring roll.
So I think.
Spring roll.
Spring roll is refried.
So I think the difference here is that because they're not actually, because of the legal implications, you can't move upwards because so Malaysians would never allow refugees to be cooking the food. like legally be a sous chef. So they're kind of limited.
But the food gonna be halal, right?
Yeah, but yeah, it will be halal, but it's. But no, that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah,
We may find something like that in your questionnaire.
yeah, that's true. Yes.
No, I think interesting like presentation and many questions, right? But I thought when you look your like research, you try to look at refugees, how they like integrate into the labor market in Malaysia. But I thought it might be like interesting to look in the other way also, because you have the data in your survey that how refugees can like give the benefit to like Malaysia labor market. Right? So you may look at the wage differentials like between Malaysian and refugee, right? And maybe you look at only in the KL and look at how refugee can improve productivity in the Malaysian labor market. So because right now I have many questions about the refugees, asylum seeker and other things, and many including Australia don't want to get this kind of people. Yeah. So
actually, the funny thing is, a lot of our studies are funded by Australia.
So maybe if you can prove that this can improve some productivity, or they can give some benefit to the host country, it might be interesting to get this kind of thing. Maybe I don't know. Yeah, I still have some questions on that also.
Thank you. Cool. We can talk more later.
The student, do you have any question? No. Okay.
All right. So if you don't have any questions, so we would like to say thank you so much.
Thank you
for giving this talk to us. Okay. So please join me in giving million of thanks to Dr. Melati.
Thank you. I hope maybe I'll come back next year and give you a model and identification and whatnot.